Hey everyone. Tonight we're going to step back into a time when the world was darker, colder, and just a little bit more dangerous. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the castles were tall, the streets were muddy, and the jobs were the stuff of nightmares. Forget whatever complaints you might have about your office chair or your boss's awkward small talk. Imagine a world where your workday involves wading through ankle-deep human waste, crawling into collapsing tunnels, or risking death just to keep rats from eating the grain. If the thought of that makes you squirm, that's good. You're getting into the right mindset. Because tonight we're not talking about kings and knights and glittering courts. We're not here for jousts or shiny armor or the romanticized Middle Ages that Hollywood loves to sell us. We're going into the shadows, into the corners of medieval towns where the work was filthy, dangerous, and so unsettling that it would keep most of us awake at night. These were the jobs that people didn't brag about, the ones they did because they had no choice, because survival was the only real luxury. So before we dive in, take a moment to settle into the night. Maybe turn down the lights, let the hum of your fan or the patter of rain outside your window set the mood. These are not stories about heroism or glory, but about what it actually took to keep a medieval world functioning. And trust me, some of these jobs will make you grateful for whatever boring modern work you're stuck with right now. If you enjoy these quiet late-night wanderings through history, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if this is your thing. I don't want you here out of pity. I want you here because you actually want to be part of this odd little corner of the internet. And, as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing the little snapshots of all of you, someone brushing their teeth in Chicago at midnight, someone curled up under blankets in London at 5 a.m., someone walking their dog in Sydney under the afternoon sun. It's like we're all connected across time zones, listening to the strange, dark stories of the past. Tonight, our theme is the scariest jobs in the Middle Ages. These were not easy gigs. They were dirty, exhausting, and often life-threatening. These were the kinds of jobs where you didn't wake up thinking about career advancement. You woke up hoping you'd just make it to the end of the day alive and in one piece. So let's ease into this. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a medieval town, wood smoke in the air, the tang of iron from a blacksmith's forge, and underneath all of that, the sour stench of waste and rot that no one could ever quite get rid of. That's the world we're stepping into. And our first stop? Oh, it's a grim one. We're starting with a job that might just make you gag before we even get to the halfway point. You've probably never heard of it unless you've dug into the very unglamorous parts of history. But it's as essential as it is disgusting. We're going straight to the gutters, to the pits, and into the shadows with the night soil men. Picture this. It's late at night, the town is quiet except for the occasional barking dog or the creak of a wooden sign swinging in the wind. While everyone else is asleep, dreaming in their warm beds, you're stepping out into the dark with a shovel in one hand and a bucket in the other. The air is cold, damp, and carries a smell you can't escape, a smell that clings to your clothes, your hair, even your skin. You are a night soil man, and your entire job is to deal with the one thing nobody else wants to think about: human waste. There are no toilets, no sewer systems, no neat little plumbing pipes carrying things away. Instead, there are cesspits. Think of them like deep, open graves where all the waste from a household or a building collects. Over time, these pits fill up. And when they do, someone has to climb in there and scoop it out. That someone is you. There's no protective gear. There's no mask, no gloves. Just you, the stink, and the vague hope that you won't pass out from the toxic fumes. You'd work under the cover of night because no one wanted to see you doing it. You were the invisible cleaner of the medieval world. But invisible is the wrong word, because the smell made you impossible to ignore. People would wrinkle their noses when you walked past. They'd avoid you on the street. They needed you desperately, but they didn't want to acknowledge you. And so you became this shadowy figure, a necessary evil lurking in the alleys and cesspits of the town. The work was dangerous. The gases rising from those pits, methane, ammonia, could knock you out cold. There are stories of night soil men dying in the pits, suffocating because they went too deep or stayed too long. Imagine sinking into that dark, wet muck and realizing you can't climb out fast enough. You'd hear about pits collapsing under their own weight, swallowing the workers whole. And yet, people took the job because someone had to do it. Someone had to keep the streets from becoming unlivable. There's something almost heroic about it in a grim way. The night soil men were the unsung sanitation workers of their time. Without them, disease would have spread even faster than it already did. Plague, dysentery, typhoid, these were constant threats, and waste was often at the heart of it. The night soil men helped keep the balance, but they got no thanks. No statues were built for them. No songs were sung. They were just there, working in the dark. It's hard to even imagine the sensory overload of that job. The weight of the buckets, the heat of the waste when it's fresh, the sticky mud underfoot, the way the smell followed you home and never really washed off. Even if you were lucky enough to avoid sickness, your life expectancy wasn't great. And socially, you were at the bottom. People might nod to you in passing because they had to, but you were always marked by what you did. And yet without you, the city collapses. Now that we've waded through the filth of medieval streets, let's go deeper, literally into the earth, where the darkness isn't just a passing shadow, but a constant companion. Welcome to the mines, where men worked bent and crawling, scraping rock from stone with the most basic of tools, inhaling the dust that would eventually poison their blood and rot their lungs from the inside out. Mining in the Middle Ages wasn't just a job, it was a slow, grinding death sentence, disguised as labor. You start before dawn because underground there's no such thing as day or night. Light is a luxury you carry with you, a flickering candle or a smoky oil lamp that barely pushes back the shadows. The tunnels are narrow and low, so low you can't stand upright. You crawl on your stomach like some pale, underground animal, dragging your tools behind you. The air is stale, damp and heavy, and every breath you take tastes faintly of metal. There's no ventilation, no fresh air. The deeper you go, the hotter it gets, as though you're creeping closer to the heart of the earth itself. Sweat mixes with the dirt on your skin until you're coated in a grimy paste. Your hands blister from the pickaxe, your knees ache from crawling, and you can feel every single breath burning its way through your lungs. You don't know it yet, no one does, but every inhale is pulling in particles of lead, silver, or tin dust, and over time it's going to ruin you. Lead mining was particularly deadly. The metal seeps into your blood, poisoning you slowly. Your teeth start to fall out. Your skin grows pale and sallow, your mind dulls. You develop something they used to call miner's rot, where your joints ache so badly you can barely lift a tool. And still you keep working because there's no other way to feed your family. The danger doesn't just come from the poison. At any moment the tunnel could collapse. You'd hear the cracking sound, wooden beams shifting under the weight of the earth above, and in those seconds your heart would pound so loudly it drowned out everything else. Sometimes you could make a run for it, sometimes you couldn't. There are stories of men who were buried alive, suffocating in the dark, while the rest of the miners, helpless and terrified, listened to the sound of their fists pounding against the rock.
Mining wasn't just dangerous, it was also isolating. You'd spend hours, even days, underground, away from the sun, until your eyes hurt when you emerged. The darkness became a second skin. Some miners talked about hearing things in the tunnels, whispers or groans they swore came from the rocks themselves. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on them. Maybe it was something else. In a world where superstition ruled, mines were often considered haunted places, cursed by the souls of those who died inside.
The strangest part? Society needed these men. Every piece of silver used in coins, every pipe made from lead, every tool or weapon crafted from metal, it all came from these dark, deadly tunnels. And yet miners were seen as expendable. They were not honored. They were not remembered. They were just the invisible backbone of industry, toiling underground until the dust and the dark finally claimed them. Imagine finishing a day of work like that, your body aching, your lungs wheezing, and then waking up the next morning knowing you have to do it all again, day after day, week after week, until one day you don't come back out. If you thought the night soil men had it bad, at least they got to see the stars. For miners, the stars were something you only saw on the way to work, and maybe on the way home if you were lucky enough to survive the day. Let's climb back out of the earth and into the narrow, stinking streets of the medieval town, where something else is waiting in the shadows. Rats. Everywhere. Not cute little pet rats, not the kind you see running on a wheel in someone's apartment. No, these were huge, filthy, disease-carrying rats, and they thrived in the squalor of medieval cities. Grain stores, bakeries, even homes, they were everywhere, and they brought death with them. Enter the rat catchers. If your skin's crawling just thinking about it, good, because this was a job that required a stomach of steel and the kind of courage that feels less like bravery and more like desperation. Rat catchers were paid to rid towns of their vermin problem, and they did it with whatever tools they had. Poison, traps, sticks, even their bare hands when things got desperate. But catching rats wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Rats bite, and their bites were often infected. Worse, they carried fleas, and those fleas carried the plague. The Black Death wasn't some distant, abstract fear. It was real. It was fast. And if you were a rat catcher, you were constantly exposed to the very creatures spreading it.
Imagine crouching in a dark corner of a barn, listening to the scrabble of tiny claws in the straw, knowing that just one bite could mean fever, boils, and death within days. You'd bring ferrets or dogs with you, trained to flush the rats out. You'd smash them, trap them, poison them. It was brutal work, and it never really ended because no matter how many you caught, there were always more.
The smell of dead rats lingered on you. People knew you by it. Like the night soil men, you were necessary but never truly welcome. You walked this strange line between public service and social revulsion. Kids might follow you out of curiosity, but adults kept their distance. And yet, in some ways, rat catchers had power. They understood the behavior of these animals in ways no one else did. They knew where the nests were, how to bait them, how to track their movements. In a time of plague, when fear of rats reached its peak, a good rat catcher was both feared and valued. You needed them, but you didn't want to be them. So when you think of the Middle Ages with its grimy streets and overcrowded towns, picture the rat catchers crawling through cellars and sewers, their ears tuned to the sound of scratching claws, their eyes scanning for the flick of a tail. It was one of the most thankless jobs of the era, and also one of the most terrifying. If the night soil men were knee-deep in filth, and the rat catchers were knee-deep in vermin, the plague doctors and death handlers were neck-deep in the one thing no one in the Middle Ages could escape: death itself. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, entire towns were gutted in weeks. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that a third of your neighbors were gone, their houses silent, their doors marked with crude red crosses. The streets smelled of rot and fear, and every cough could mean the end. And into that chaos walked the plague doctors. They looked like something out of a nightmare. You've seen the mask, long curved beak, round glassy eyes that turn their faces into something alien and insect-like. It's one of those images that's so creepy you'd think it was designed to scare people, but in reality the beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, and sometimes even vinegar-soaked cloth. The doctors believed that miasma, or bad air, was what spread the plague, and these fragrant herbs were supposed to filter it. Of course, it didn't work, but at least it gave them the illusion of safety as they waded through streets lined with the dying. Picture yourself wearing that mask, the leather gown creaking as you move, gloves slick with sweat inside. You knock on doors, and what greets you isn't the hopeful face of someone looking for a cure, but the grey, sunken face of someone who already knows they're too far gone. The buboes, those painful, swollen lumps, were everywhere on their bodies. You couldn't help them. All you could do was diagnose, record, and sometimes advise families to burn everything the sick person touched. That was the job. You weren't there to save lives, you were there to count the dead and try not to become one of them. And then there were the death handlers, the ones who followed behind the plague doctors like shadows. If the doctor was the messenger of death, the handlers were its clean-up crew. These were the people who went into infected houses, dragged out the corpses, and dumped them into carts. They didn't have protective gear. Sometimes they barely had clothes. The stench of decay was everywhere, in their hair, under their nails, in the back of their throats. You could try to cover your mouth with a rag soaked in wine, but the smell would still find you. The carts they pushed through the streets became a grim symbol of the time. "Bring out your dead" wasn't just a phrase, it was the soundtrack of the plague years. They'd ring bells or shout to let the living know the dead were being collected, and families would quietly place the bodies of their loved ones outside, wrapped in thin blankets or nothing at all. There wasn't time for funerals, there wasn't space for graves. The death handlers dug huge pits, mass graves, and dumped the bodies in like firewood. The toll this took on them wasn't just physical. Imagine living in a world where every day you touch death, breathe death, and know that any second you might become one of the corpses you're carrying. People avoided the plague doctors and handlers, not just because of fear of infection, but because they saw them as cursed. They were walking reminders that the end was coming. And yet, like every other awful job we've talked about, these roles were vital. Without someone to count the sick and remove the dead, towns would have been overrun with corpses and the disease would have spread even faster. It's a grim, thankless kind of heroism, the kind that doesn't make it into legends or songs but keeps the living alive just a little bit longer. If death handlers dealt with the dead, executioners dealt with the act of death itself. They were the ones who stood on the scaffold, axe or sword in hand, staring out at a crowd that wasn't horrified but entertained. In the Middle Ages, executions weren't quiet, hidden events. They were public spectacles like twisted theatre. People gathered in the town square not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to watch. This was the drama of justice, and the executioner was the lead actor, the one no one really wanted to meet off stage. Being an executioner was a strange, terrifying job. On one hand, you were officially employed by the crown or the local lord. You were necessary. Justice couldn't be served without someone like you. On the other hand, you were despised. People saw you as tainted, as if death clung to your very skin. You might be given a house or a salary, but you'd live outside the main town because no one wanted you near their families. Children would whisper your name like it was a curse. Adults would avoid your gaze. And the pressure of the job? Unimaginable. A clean execution was rare. It wasn't as simple as swinging an axe once and calling it a day. Swords and axes weren't always sharp. Sometimes the condemned would flinch or move, sometimes your aim would be off. A botched execution where you had to swing again and maybe again was not only horrifying for the victim, but for the crowd who might turn violent if you ruined their spectacle. There are stories of executioners being torn apart by angry mobs when things went wrong. It wasn't just beheadings either. Executioners were expected to handle hangings, burnings, and even torture. The wheel, a gruesome method where limbs were broken one by one, was part of their job. Imagine standing there, breaking someone's bones while the crowd cheers, knowing that your only skill in life is ending other people's lives in ways that are both efficient and entertaining. And yet, for all the horror, the executioner carried a strange kind of power. They were both feared and needed. People might avoid you, but they also respected the sharp edge of your blade. Some executioners became almost legendary for their skill, which is a chilling thought, being famous for how cleanly you could separate a head from a body. But when the crowd went home and the scaffold was empty, you were left with what you'd done. Some executioners drank themselves to death, haunted by the faces of the people they'd killed. Others grew cold and detached, becoming almost mechanical. Either way, it wasn't a job you retired from with peace in your heart. Let's take a moment to picture something strange. Imagine a giant wooden wheel, taller than a man, wide enough that a person can step inside and start walking like a human hamster. Only this isn't for exercise and it's not a game. This is your job. You climb into the treadwheel and you walk. You keep walking, step after step after step, hour after hour, until your legs shake and your breath feels like fire in your chest. This was the life of a medieval treadwheel worker, human engines that powered cranes, mills, and all the heavy lifting that the towns needed but didn't have the animals or technology to do. The treadwheel was usually used in construction, especially for cathedrals or castle walls. Think about it. They didn't have powered cranes or hydraulic lifts. They had this, massive wooden machines with rope pulleys, and someone had to get inside to make it work. That someone was usually a poor laborer, a prisoner, or anyone desperate enough to trade exhaustion for a few coins. Once you started walking, the wheel would slowly turn, winding ropes to lift huge stones or heavy beams. It was the kind of work where, if you stumbled, you didn't just get a bruise, you could be dragged down by the wheel, crushed under its weight, or thrown off to break bones on the ground below. The physical toll was relentless. Your feet would blister and bleed from the constant friction. Your legs swelled from the strain. And if you were unlucky enough to be working high up on scaffolding, because yes, sometimes these treadwheels were perched precariously on wooden frames, dozens of feet in the air, one wrong step could send you plummeting to your death. There were no safety rails, no harnesses, no one even checking to see if you were okay. If you fell, they just found someone else to take your place. And there's this haunting silence to the job. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic. You're just walking. Like a beast of burden, but you're human and you know you're human, which makes it worse. Hours of trudging in a circle, your world reduced to wood creaks, rope groans, and the distant voices of the workers shouting instructions. The treadwheel didn't care if you were tired, or if your muscles ached so much you thought they might tear. You kept walking because stopping meant slowing down the entire project, and stopping too long meant losing your job entirely. Sometimes treadwheel workers weren't even paid. They were prisoners, condemned to this grueling labor as a punishment. Imagine that for a moment, your entire existence reduced to powering someone else's grand cathedral while you watch the light shift through a small opening. Never free, never done. If medieval jobs were a hierarchy of suffering, treadwheel laborers were somewhere near the top, caught between exhaustion and the constant risk of death by machinery. And here's the eerie part. Treadwheels were also used for executions. In some cases, criminals were strapped to wheels or forced to power them as a form of humiliation before being killed. It was as if the wheel itself became a symbol of the grinding, merciless nature of medieval life. A wheel that turned and turned, powered by human suffering, until it crushed everything in its path. When you think about medieval cathedrals, those towering, awe-inspiring buildings that still stand today, remember the treadwheel workers. The stones didn't just rise by magic. They were pulled up by men walking endlessly in circles, their sweat soaked into the wood, their lives spent powering someone else's vision of heaven. It's one of those invisible jobs where the labor is forgotten, but the results are still here, staring us in the face. If you think trudging in a giant hamster wheel sounds miserable, wait until you hear about the fullers. Their job was to take raw wool, the stuff fresh off the sheep, still full of oils, dirt, and who knows what else, and clean it so it could be spun into cloth. Sounds simple enough, right? Just wash it and dry it. But no, medieval fulling wasn't just soap and water. It was, let's call it a very organic process. You see, to get the grease out of wool, you needed something acidic, something that could break down the oils. Soap wasn't widely available or affordable, so the solution was urine. Yes, human urine. Fullers would collect buckets of stale urine. Publicly, in some towns, people even saved their household urine for this purpose and dump it into large vats. Then they'd climb in, barefoot, and stomp on the wool like grapes in a wine press. Only instead of making wine, you're making your feet smell like something that could strip paint off a wall. The stench was unimaginable, warm, fermented urine clinging to your clothes and your skin. You couldn't wash it out easily because clean water was scarce. Fullers were like walking warnings of their own profession. People crossed the street to avoid them. But worse than the smell was the constant exposure. You'd stand for hours in that liquid, your feet and legs soaked, your skin raw and cracked, and if you had even a small cut, infection could set in fast. The job was backbreaking too. You'd stomp, twist, and press the wool until it was soft enough, then haul it out to rinse and stretch it. All of this had to be done by hand, with heavy, wet bundles of cloth that weighed more than you'd want to carry even once, let alone all day. There were no shortcuts, just sweat, stink, and the knowledge that you'd be doing the exact same thing tomorrow. Fullers were essential, though. Wool was the backbone of medieval trade, especially in places like England and Flanders. Without fullers, there was no clean, workable fabric. They were the hidden force behind every cloak, every tunic, every banner. But no one celebrated them. They were seen as filthy, low-class, and disposable. And if you think that sounds bad, imagine living in a town where the fuller's workshop is nearby. The smell alone would seep into everything, your food, your clothes, even your dreams. Some towns actually regulated where fullers could set up shop, forcing them to work on the outskirts downwind so the stench didn't choke the entire village. It's one of those jobs where you can't even wrap your head around doing it for a living, day after day, stomping in human waste just to make sure someone else has a nice, clean cloak to wear. It's miserable, it's necessary, and it's exactly the kind of quiet suffering that defined so many medieval trades. Now let's step into the shoes of those who weren't buried in waste, crawling through mines or stomping in vats of urine, but who still lived every single day with one foot in the grave, bell ringers and night watchmen. At first glance, these jobs sound almost harmless. Ringing bells, walking around at night. Compared to pulling corpses out of plague houses, it doesn't seem that bad. But the truth is that both jobs were soaked in risk and dread, just in subtler, more insidious ways. The bell ringer, for example, wasn't just a guy pulling on a rope a few times a day to call people to church. Bells were the heartbeat of medieval towns. They rang for fires, for invasions, for curfews, for deaths. A bell ringer was like a living alarm system, and that meant when something terrible happened, he had to be there first. Imagine sprinting up a spiraling stone staircase, 2 steps at a time, your lungs burning, while outside, the town is on fire or raiders are storming the gates. Your job is to get to that tower, grab the rope, and start ringing like your life depends on it, because it does. The towers themselves were deadly. Picture being perched at the top of a cathedral bell tower, exposed to wind and lightning with no safety harness, pulling on ropes as thick as your arm. If your grip slipped and that rope wrapped around you the wrong way, it could pull you straight into the air and slam you into the wooden beams with bone-breaking force. If lightning struck the tower, and it often did, you were standing next to a giant bronze conductor, basically inviting the storm to come down through your body. And when plague struck, bell ringers were expected to toll the dead bell constantly, announcing death after death, day and night. That sound, heavy and mournful, seeped into their minds. Some of them went mad just from the toll of knowing they were the herald of every disaster. Then there were the watchmen trudging through the dark streets with nothing but a lantern and a stick calling out the hours. It sounds romantic in the old stories, doesn't it? But there was nothing romantic about walking those streets when the world was asleep. The towns were alive with shadows, thieves, drunkards, wolves creeping in from the outskirts, and sometimes something far worse, fire. Fire was the nightmare of every medieval town, where buildings were mostly wood, and thatched roofs burned like kindling. If a watchman didn't catch it fast enough, a single spark could level half the town before sunrise. And in times of plague or war, being a watchman was practically a death sentence. You'd patrol streets where the sick groaned in their beds, and if you got too close, you risked catching whatever they had. Your job was to maintain order, but how do you maintain order when half the town is dying and the other half is panicking? You'd be the one knocking on doors to enforce curfews, or standing guard over mass graves, or chasing down someone who'd stolen food from a plague house. The fear of infection was constant, but the fear of failing your duty was worse. Neither the bell ringer nor the watchman were celebrated. They were background figures, their labor invisible until disaster struck. But when something did go wrong, they were the first in the line of danger, the first to climb the burning tower, the first to walk into streets full of screaming chaos, and if they survived, they just went back to their quiet lives, waiting for the next disaster to ring the bells or light the lanterns again. So here we are, standing at the end of this grim little journey through the scariest jobs of the Middle Ages. We've waded through the stink of the night's soil men, crawled into the suffocating tunnels with the lead miners, dodged rats with the catchers, walked beside death with the plague doctors, stood on the scaffold with the executioners, powered the massive wheels, stomped wool in urine with the fullers, and finally walked the silent, dangerous nights with the bell ringers and watchmen. If there's one thing that ties all these jobs together, it's this. None of them were glamorous, none of them were celebrated, but every single one of them kept the medieval world turning. Without these people, these anonymous, often forgotten laborers, life in the Middle Ages would have been even shorter, dirtier, and deadlier than it already was. These were the people who dealt with the filth, with the fear, with the death, so that everyone else could live just a little bit more comfortably. It's strange to think about, isn't it? We complain about our jobs today, about emails and traffic and annoying meetings, but at least we're not climbing into cesspits or breathing in lead dust that will rot us from the inside out. At least our biggest workplace hazard isn't being buried alive under a collapsing tunnel. There's something almost humbling about that. So as you settle in tonight, maybe under a warm blanket, maybe listening to the soft hum of your fan or the rain tapping at your window, take a moment to remember these forgotten workers. The night soil men who scrubbed the waste of 1,000 lives, the miners who bled into the earth for silver coins, the plague doctors who walked into houses everyone else ran from, the executioners who carried death like a shadow on their backs. They weren't heroes, they weren't villains. They were just people doing what they had to do to survive. And maybe, if you close your eyes, you can still hear the faint toll of a bell, or the creak of a treadwheel, or the whisper of footsteps in a dark, medieval alley. The sound of lives spent in service of a world that rarely thanked them, the kind of history that lingers long after the lights go out.